Flaws in your supply chain can have a devastating impact on your business's security. There's probably no greater example of that than the one that hit the news in 2020 with SolarWinds. We can have suppliers that can have complex chains of dependency, huge numbers of different pieces of software from different places, and infrastructure from multiple cloud providers. It's becoming just simply much more complex to be able to keep track of the code and the devices and processes that are in our environments. The challenge is, of course, we don't get as much access to these supply chain environments to do our own security assurances, and yet they can have as much impact as a device or a service or piece of software that we put in place. So supply chain management is simply bound to be a huge theme of the next few years. Nation states have learned they're an interesting target that can enable them to access large numbers of enterprises with one vulnerability found. They're worth the investment from an attacker perspective. So let's talk about a few top tips, things that organizations can do to mitigate some of these risks and reduce the possibility of supply chain problems. So Giorgia, you get to go first. No pressure. Solve supply chain security for us with one silver bullet, would you?
Yeah, no problem. So I think that the most obvious one for us is make sure you are performing thorough due diligence on your suppliers during the onboarding stage.
Yeah, that's a great one. I mean, embedding a security checklist with your procurement team to make sure that security basics are assessed is a great place to start. Does the organization that you're talking to do regular penetration testing? Do they hold any security standards like SOC 2 that you can trust have been audited and assure a level of competence? You know, you can look at how you can embed some of those simple checks and balances so that every supplier has some of those basics taken care of. Now, that's not the same as a thorough security assessment, right? You can't expect your procurement team to pick up on every cybersecurity nuance, but they can ask some good questions. So I suppose that would be my second one, actually. You give me an easy lead in there. Security assessments on suppliers make just as much sense as our own infrastructure. We can run pen tests and scans to validate that their infrastructure is secure as well. It's behaving in the expected parameters. That does require a bit of forethought. Of course, these businesses have their own schedules, they have multiple customers, so you often need to make specific agreements at the contracting and procurement stage to enable you to do those assessments. Some suppliers have grown more mature. For example, Amazon just say, pen test us anytime. But for lots of these organizations, you need to put those provisions in early so you can run your own risk assessments. All right, give us another one.
Okay, so looking more internally this time, it's keeping track of your organisational assets, primarily software and hardware.
Yeah, that makes sense in all of security, right? You cannot protect what you don't know is there. The challenge on the supply chain side is often you'll have people introducing software and services into your environment that don't go through your more conventional asset purchase process. You may have a service that's connected, a VPN tunnel, or maybe a physical hardware device operating under a different management schedule, you know, where third parties are coming in and looking after that device physically. Very common in manufacturing and hospital environments, for example. So doing asset discovery, making sure you understand what you have in your environment and the holes you're punching is very, very logical. I'm going to pick next, it seems a bit pessimistic, but planning for it all to go wrong.
Of course. Having
an incident response plan. There's no doubt that, you know, supply chain can be a real point of pressure on a team's incident response plan. You're dealing with another company. Who do you contact? How do they notify you? How do you share information? Some of the basics you take for granted when doing IR in your own organization don't roll over well to other organizations. Now, ideally, we'd all like to run an incident response exercise with our supply chain, but for a lot of these providers, it's going to be a do you want the service or not type procurement discussion. So that may not always be tenable. In that scenario, having your own team understand the importance of a named contact at the vendor, a known escalation point, knowing how you can ask questions in the event of a breach and raise the alarm is probably one of the single most important things you can do in advance.
And just looking at that human aspect, user training and awareness programs remain a key topic and no less relevant for supplier management.
Yeah, I think that's right. You know, using folks as human fire alarms,
right,
if you will, particularly for supply chain too. You know, if I look at factory environments I've been in where there are complex and rather dated systems being supplied by third parties, some of the operators of those systems know way more about their normal behavior than the cybersecurity folks. They're actually the perfect people to spot, hey, something doesn't look right. Why is that moving on its own? Why is that changed? So bringing them into the fold, recruiting those humans as detectors of issues in your supply chain might be more effective than even trying to scale the cybersecurity team to those efforts, you know, itself. I suppose the human thing also extends technically. You have a supply chain that's putting devices or services into your environment. How are you going to put a bubble around them to monitor them? How will you keep track of, you know, the kind of holes that are being punched, the data that's being exchanged? Could your team notice that there was an anomalously large volume of data flowing to supplier X that has a somewhat trusted link into your environment? Sometimes there are technical countermeasures at the endpoint or network level that can help us assure the normal behavior of those supplier connections. That can be incredibly valuable to think about proactively.
Now, last but not least, James, can you talk to us about the importance of least privilege?
Yeah. So this is a security design principle. The principle of least privilege states that you only give someone or something access to what they need to be able to do their job effectively. This isn't often followed religiously with supply chain. You know, a supplier has been brought in to do X. You know, they need access to a specific set of data in a specific database. They need read-only access to that information to be able to do a thing. The principle of least privilege says you give them an account that can access that thing, that data, and can read it, not modify it. Often these service accounts, these processes, these privileges associated with supply chain end up overly broad. And it's not because people aren't well intending, but these supply chain setups often occur under pressure. There's often kind of contracted timeframes where the supplier is available to get that setup done. And if something's not working right, adding a few extra permissions to try to fix it is a very common troubleshooting technique. You could argue, when you do your asset review that we talked about earlier and you look at those services, it's the perfect time to review the permissions, the privileges, and make sure they adhere to that least privilege principle. If you do that, when something goes wrong, the data the attackers will be able to access or modify is going to be much more severely restricted. Most environments end up being like a Rolo chocolate, you know, hard on the outside, soft and gooey on the inside. And that's not a desirable state when it comes to your supply chain being able to access way too much data if an attacker compromises them.
So, James, how can we help teams?
Well, supply chain is an extension of your environment, and we can help by having our teams review the practices, the policies, the things that procurement check before bringing a service in. We can help with testing specific services and negotiating a time, a place, and a safe scope that will make that vendor comfortable with the engagement. We can help with reviewing permissions and the process to adapt the principle of least privilege. All of these are sensible places to spend time. And it's funny to me because so many organizations will focus on their internal assets, their internal teams, and their own applications, when all they really needed to avoid a nasty breach was 2 or 3 supply chain focused activities throughout the year. That's something we can help with. I really hope you enjoyed the video and you found some useful things that you can apply within your own workplace to enhance your cybersecurity practices. Now, there'll be more videos in this series, and we're always looking for ways to make the lives of our customers easier. So if you have a particular topic you think is compelling, something that's keeping you up at night or you're just confused about, we want to hear about it, and it could feature later in our series as well. Good luck applying these practices within your organisation and making the world a little bit more secure.